Hello, welcome to your discussion on digital authoritarianism in Iran and Russia. My name is Marila Mensch. I work at the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies at Concordia University. This event is actually part of a special series supported by the US Embassy in Ottawa. So thank you to our colleagues in Ottawa and in Montreal for their support. So as I said, today we're planning on discussing digital authoritarianism in Russia and Iran to look at the tactics that both regimes are using. It's my pleasure to welcome today Andrea Kendall-Taylor, Senior Fellow and Director of the Transatlantic Security Program at the Center for New American Security, Alina Poliakova, CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis, and Amin Sabeti, Executive Director of the Digital Impact Lab and founder of CERTFA. First, we'll give each speaker 4 or 5 minutes to introduce their work, to talk about why this issue is important to them, and when they first started looking at the relationship between human rights and technology. So perhaps we can start with Alina. Alina, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Marie, and it's really nice to see some new colleagues and old colleagues here on the panel as well. I think as a way of opening, since you asked us to say a couple of words as to why we're interested in the subject matter, before we get into the substantive elements of the issue set. Well, I think for me, I came to the study of digital authoritarianism through the lens of understanding how countries like Russia in particular have been using technologies to first launch disinformation campaigns through social media platforms in the broader online space, but also to increasingly surveil and repress the Russian domestic population. And how do we understand these kinds of models of the use of technology to repress, to surveil, in many cases to more broadly control and deflect protest, make that very unappealing to domestic publics in places like Russia versus other places like China, which we often talk about, or Iran, which we'll be talking about in this panel. And I was really interested in initially how this was happening in countries close to Russia's own borders, like Ukraine and other countries of the so-called former Soviet space. But of course, this is an issue that in many ways we're struggling with in democracies as well, in terms of how to respond to these trends, the marriage of authoritarian states and technologies, while at the same time, how do we have our own battles in democratic societies about the regulation of new technologies and emerging technologies, and ensuring that it's a values-based regulatory environment rather than leaving the space open to authoritarian states like Russia to really set the rules of the road. So to my mind, I really came to this early on through the lens of seeing what Russia was doing at home, but also in its so-called near abroad. But it's really now very much a global issue and one that is increasingly becoming more and more complex. And I'm sure we'll talk about that throughout this panel today.
Thank you very much, Alina. Andrea, do you want to go next?
Sure, happy to. So I came to this through a slightly different path. I've spent a lot of my time studying authoritarian regimes and the political dynamics of autocracies. And in my research have been really focused on understanding how authoritarianism has evolved in the post-Cold War era. So you can find things, we've done research showing, for example, that more authoritarian regimes are now being unseated by protests. We can see that more autocracies now are being born by the slow degradation of democracy rather than, the more kind of clear, concise rupture of democracy through coups. And it was really notable to me that these changes were also coinciding with changes in digital technologies. And so for me, that kind of prompted really interesting questions and led me down a path of new research. And so I think this topic is just so important because you can see that digital technologies are really having a profound effect on the nature of authoritarianism. Initially, I know we all understand our thinking at the, near the turn of the century where we saw new technologies and viewed them as, with great hope and optimism. And we believe that it would allow individuals to have greater access to information, new possibilities to make connections, build communities. But instead, what's become clear in the last 20 years is that these new technologies are now affording rulers fresh methods for preserving their power. So as I said, we had seen that protests become the most common way that autocracies have fallen, but now authoritarian regimes are learning and adapting, and they're using digital repression in ways that actually helps them lower their risk of protest. And that was one of the things we found in our research. We saw that those regimes where digital repression was higher actually had a lower risk of protest. We also found that it affected their survival tactics in terms of how they use repression. So when digital regimes use these online kind of digital repressive tactics, it actually enabled them and facilitated them to increase their use of repression in real life, particularly torture and the killing of opponents. It was basically making it easier for authoritarian regimes to identify their opposition. And we see then ultimately at the end, it's those authoritarian regimes that use digital technologies that have actually become more durable. So where the digital repression is higher, they're actually surviving in office longer than those regimes where digital repression is less significant. And so for all those reasons, I think it's really a critical topic. And I'm excited to spend the rest of the panel talking in particular about what's happening for my part, on Russia, but also hearing about what's happening in Iran as well.
Thank you very much, Andrea. This is fascinating research. I'm looking forward to hearing more about it. Amin, finally, last but not least, please introduce yourself and why you got interested in this subject. Amin, you need to unmute yourself. Sorry. Thanks.
Oh, sorry. I was part of the golden era of the blogging in Iran. See, in 2002, 2003, the blogging was a big deal in Iran. And also, it was a kind of big deal in around the world. And that time, before that, all of the power in Iran was regarding the publishing contents on the newspaper, TV station, different things was under control of the Iranian regime or Islamic Republic. Then what happened when the internet came in Iran and then blogging came, it was a kind of huge opportunity for people around the country, especially people who live in a small town like me. I used to live in Zahedan. Then it helps us to use the blogging to express ourselves and also share our opinion. That, when we started the blogging, what happened? It's initially it was a kind of free word. Everyone, they can talk about anything, and suddenly, the President Khatami has started to block blogs, and also they initially started from blocking of the pornography website, but eventually, same as the other authoritarian regime, they just increased the scope. Then over time, what happened? Then I've seen the Iranian regime, they have changed their tactics from the just blocking to also from the kind of defense go to the offense. That's the reason, for instance, I found the CERTFA, which is a kind of a digital security platform, which we've been tracking activities of the Iranian state-backed hackers like Charming Kitten, which since, let's say, 2009, which was the year Grim movement happened in Iran. What we saw that time is since then we saw, apart from the blocking website and also the stopping of the freedom of information around the country, what happened? They started also to harass journalists, activists around the world, especially Iranian diaspora, and start by hacking their account, by just set up a kind of fake interview with them to just discredit themselves, discredit the Iranian activists and journalists. For that, then for this reason, over time, I've become interested about the role of technology in Iran, and also especially how we can use technology to promote the human rights in Iran. Although it's a kind of different topic, but in terms of what's the impact of the technology, how we can use technology to promote the human rights in Iran.
Thank you very much, Amin. So what we want to do today during our question time is perhaps look at the similarities and differences between Iran and Russia. In our previous discussions, we looked at China, for example, which, a country that has a lot more resources in terms of technology and money. So perhaps we're going to start with Andrea. Andrea, what role has the internet played in Russia's authoritarianism and in maintaining Vladimir Putin in power, based on your research?
Sure. So it's a great question. It's remarkable, especially you just mentioned China, to note kind of what different places Russia and China started from. Russia in particular, until recently, had allowed a relatively free and open information space where Russians could enjoy, relatively open conversations online. But I think the thing that's most alarming is that it's clear that Putin now sees, more broadly the information environment as a space for contestation. I think he's grown increasingly concerned about threats to his hold on power. And so we've seen him really take some very proactive steps to crack down on the information space inside of Russia. And it's notable because I think a lot of people who watched Russia historically had said that Putin would be reticent or hesitant to do that because so many Russians, and young Russians in particular, have for such a long time enjoyed those relative freedoms online, that if he took steps to crack down on those spaces, that it would be likely to elicit backlash from the Russian public. But here we see it's almost like the frog in the boiling pot of water, where slowly, gradually, incrementally, he's been cracking down on the space. And so far, there hasn't been any widespread concerted pushback from the Russian public. So, there's been a number of steps that he's taken, and we can talk about how Russia's tactics are evolving. But really, there's been kind of a change, an evolution of Russia's legal framework. Russia does a very good job at having a fairly robust but extremely vague set of laws that allow for the blocking of a wide variety of content. Since 2012, and that was when Putin returned to power, the number of laws that underpin Russia's digital control has grown. And then the Russian authorities are very indiscriminate in the way that they implement those, which creates a chilling effect on the country's media environment. Other pillars of what they're doing, they obviously have internet surveillance. Since 2014, they have taken steps to establish a quote unquote sovereign internet that is more like the Chinese model. And of course, one of the longstanding pillars of their approach in this space is the propaganda and misinformation, which is also targeted at domestic Russians, not just weaponized externally. And then in addition, we've also seen some changes in surveillance that we can talk about if interesting too. So I guess the bottom line for me is that we have seen a really remarkable, really concerning shift in repression online. And I think that's as President Putin kind of all of the things that his popularity has based on historically high levels of economic performance. For a long time, Russians were really happy about Putin returning them to the global stage with Ukraine. Those things, that euphoria has faded. The economy is not doing well. They have a difficult situation with COVID. So a lot of the key pillars of Putin's support are no longer as strong as they once were. And so I think he sees no other alternative but to start cracking down on these freedoms that he views as a real threat to his hold on power, and is cracking down in that online space.
Thank you, Andrea. Before we go on a little bit more with Alina on the different tactics, I'd like to see with Amin, what was it like in Russia? What led the Iranian regime to see the internet as a strategic battleground for regime stability in Iran? And what justifications for internet censorship and surveillance do they give?
In general, the Iranian regime, if you look at the history of the Iranian regime since the Islamic Revolution in 1979, they always against new technology. It started with the video cassette, then it goes to the satellite, and then when internet came to the country, they went after internet. Then Iran really loves to be like China in terms of the control of the internet. and also in an ideal world, they love to be such same as North Korea, which there isn't a kind of internet as a I mean the definition of internet. There should be a kind of intranet, or they call it national internet or halal internet. There are different names for it. They just name it clean internet, which from their point of view, they believe there shouldn't be any kind of content against the Islamic regime from their point of view. For instance, they shouldn't. No one can. If you criticize, let's say, it shouldn't be the supreme leader. It's just kind of Iranian official. Your content can be audio, video. They shouldn't be on their ideal internet. Since let's say the first government of Ahmadinejad, it was 2004. What happened? It's 2004. It's what happened. It's the Iranian regime. They've been trying to develop the kind of Chinese version of the internet, as I mentioned, kind of national internet, which they can keep they can keep the user behind the firewall. They can't go and let's say check Wikipedia, Twitter, Twitter is blocked in Iran. And the recent example, one of the biggest example, which now we are in the kind of anniversary. It was in November 2019, which the Iranian regime, they completely shut down internet for more than a week, and no one could send any content, anything, out to the outside world behind Iran's border, apart from kind of vetted per individual. Then I would say, my short answer would be the Iranian regime, they love to have a kind of internet which they can to have a total control, not a kind of not the same as the Russia version. It's a kind of Chinese, but more extreme, which they can, by one click, delete whoever they want from the internet, from the face of the internet, and also any accounts.
Thank you very much. Alina, I know that in 2014, Russia kind of pioneered a law that would require the registration of blogs, and it made bloggers liable for the accuracy of their content. How have you seen digital tactics evolve in Russia to crack down on freedom of expression?
Thanks so much for the question, Marie. And just to follow up on what I think Andrea was also saying about the kind of model of digital repression that we're seeing emerge in Russia. What's interesting about it is that, yes, there's of course a desire to control data flows into Russia by the Russian government, just as China has been able to do for several decades now. But I think what's really key from what Andrea said is that it's a bit of an ad hoc approach, exactly because in the 1990s in particular, and somewhat in the early 2000s as well, there was a relatively free and unfettered internet in Russia. And now what we're really seeing is this kind of battle emerging between an increasingly repressive authoritarian regime under Mr. Putin and the kinds of freedoms that many Russian citizens have actually had access to and enjoyed now since basically the internet became a global communication platform. It's interesting to note that we're really in the middle of that right now, and American companies in particular, like YouTube, being a very prominent one, but also more broadly, Google, YouTube's parent company, I suppose, or Alphabet, whatever we want to call it these days, Apple, and many others, Twitter, are having this battle with the Russian government now, where they're being forced to comply with all kinds of repressive legal measures that undermine independent voices, opposition voices, more certainly, and just close the space for freedom of expression, which goes directly to your question. And I think it's important to know that there were several important time points in how we got to where we are in terms of Russia's digital authoritarian regime. And you point to the law that was initiated in 2014, is amended several times. We now have a very complex legal regime in Russia that severely prohibits free speech through punitive measures primarily, that not only makes individual bloggers or individuals liable for their post online, liable from perspective of it being a criminal offense, but I think the more extreme version of this has also been a new expansion of what the Russian government considers extremist. And we've seen in the last several years an expansion of an extremist label, not just to organizations and entities, but to individuals as well. And what that really means is that anybody associated with an organization the Russian government deems as extremist is basically treated like a terrorist organization. And now individuals can also be designated as extremists. And on top of that, there's two other additional kind of classifications that the Russian government has put forward over the last several years and expanded the reach of those classifications, which is the foreign agent label, which really prohibits individuals who are now liable for receiving any funding from international institutions or foreign countries or governments, and as well as the so-called undesirable label, which has made it impossible, if not very difficult, for any foreign NGOs to operate in Russia. And I mean, to operate in Russia, there are some organizations that have no operations in Russia that are just labeled undesirable by the Russian government as a bit of a symbolic way to discourage any institution abroad, any organization in the nonprofit world and NGO world from saying anything negative about the regime. So we've seen this emergence of this very complex repressive legal structure in Russia. And this is now being paired with increasingly sophisticated surveillance technologies and monitoring technologies of the broader social media domain that the Russian government is importing from China. And I think this model of digital authoritarianism that relies on a combination of a complex legal structure of repression coupled with increasingly sophisticated tracking and surveillance technologies is really a model that we're seeing replicated in other countries around the world. And I think in many ways, Russia has become sort of the example for others to follow in this particular space when they can't, for example, build out the kind of resources and capabilities that Beijing has to really be able to monitor and surveil a very large population and to combine so many different data points and then analyze those data points. It takes a huge amount of computing power, a huge amount of administrative power. That's not something that Russia has. It's not a country as wealthy or as capable in many ways as China, but that's also not a capability that many countries across the world have. And I think this is really kind of the dangerous spot we find ourselves in, that this model of Russia's version, if you want to call it that, of digital authoritarianism is the one that seems to be propagating across the world much more prominently. And I think this is where we really need to be thinking about, you know, what do we do to respond? How do we think about this reality of digital authoritarianism in variations of it really becoming a more dominant model for state technology interactions across the world?
Thank you. I mean, do you think Iran has kind of copied or done the same as Russia, using this, like, I guess, low tech model, using a mixture of technological and legal tactics? How does it resemble Russia's digital authoritarianism that Alina was talking about? And do you think it can ever become more sophisticated? Please unmute yourself, Amin.
I always forget to unmute. I don't think so that the Iranian version would be more sophisticated than Chinese or Russia. But in terms of the legal framework in Iran, we have also very, very complicated framework in terms of the who can order to block what. For instance, there's a Supreme Council of Cyberspace, which from, I mean, it's the most powerful council in Iran, which they can decide about anything about the cyberspace. But at the same time, the judicial system, police, then the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, then the supreme leader, then the government. These are all of these institutions. They can order to block a website or services. For instance, just an example, which is kind of similar for the in Russia. When Telegram was still is popular. Around more than half the population of Iranian users inside the country, they are using Telegram. Then what happened one day? A judge in a small, in a town, in one of the kind of medium-sized city, decided to sign a court order and just say, okay, let's block Telegram. And they just blocked Telegram, and no one could challenge that decision. And suddenly, in one day, the Telegram, which more than 40 million people, they use it, it was blocked. Although, over time, it was same as the other countries around the world. This internet censorship is kind of a cat and mouse game. The Iranian, they eventually hit the filter, the firewall, and then they came back and they used Telegram by circumvention tools. But legal framework is very, very complicated in Iran. And if you ask me, who can, anyone in any official in Iran, they can order to block, but to block a website or online services, then it's very, very vague. In terms of the technology, before Rouhani's administration, which now we have raised the new administration. Before Rouhani administration, what happened? Iran has a kind of low-tech for kind of blocking system. They just block IP or sometimes DNS poisoning. But the lesson learned Iranian regime, the lesson they've learned is they learn, okay, they should follow the Chinese version. In long run, they, instead of just blocking, and which, eventually the end user, they just buy circumvention tools and they just bypass the internet censorship. They need also in long run to just change the user behavior. For instance, they put it, for instance, in Iran right now, because you don't have a kind of limited, you don't have an unlimited bandwidth, you should buy every month, let's say 10 gigabit, 5 gigabit, you should buy it based on your usage. You can't go for the unlimited. Then if you have, let's say, 2 gigabit bandwidth for the internet, if you search something on Google, the valuation of that bandwidth is 1 gigabit. But if you use a kind of local domestic Iranian version of Google, let's say search engine, you can use that bandwidth 2 gigabit as a 2 gigabit. Then they just increase the cost of using international services, which in long run, lots of people at the end of the day, it's not just particularly in Iran, around the world, they look at their pocket. That's also the new method which has been implemented by Rouhani and now has been following by the Raisi. Then, but still, in terms of the technology, I would say they are not that's in level of the sophistication of same as Chinese version, but maybe it haven't because it would happen because recently Iran and China, they signed the trade deal, which one of the part of that trade deal is the Chinese government. They will help the Iranian regime to just develop different tools that are for the cyberspace.
Thank you. Andrea, should you follow up on the relationship between Russia and China? It seems that in various areas, there's a deepening relationship between the two of them. How is that reflected in their digital strategies? How are they learning from one another? Is China also learning from Russia?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a topic that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and studying. You're right that when you look across really all of the key domains of their relationship, whether it's the diplomatic, economic, technology, democracy, and human rights domains, in all of those areas, we're seeing the relationship between Russia and China deepen. And that also includes kind of what they're doing in this information domain. I don't think that there's really concrete evidence to suggest that they're explicitly coordinating their information operations, for example. But I do think we see a remarkable degree of alignment. They're finding a lot of common causes as their interests align on a number of issues and in strategic regions. So, with their digital influence campaigns, they often work in tandem and towards the same objectives. So, for example, they're both looking to use the information space, information operations to undermine liberal democratic norms and institutions. They are shared and united in their desire to try to weaken the cohesion among democratic allies and partners. They both want to reduce US global influence, and they're both then, maybe this is a little bit separate, but wanting to use the information domain to advance their own kind of positions on global affairs. They, in many cases, have used very different approaches to doing those things. But I do think that there is some evidence of learning and a bit of convergence. And I think a very good example is the information operations that Beijing used in the immediate aftermath of, at the beginning of the COVID crisis. China has traditionally sought to kind of use the information environment to have, to advance and reduce opposition to China's peaceful rise, to put China in a positive light. But after the beginning of the COVID crisis, we saw China in many ways going on the offensive a la the Kremlin. We saw a lot of disinformation tactics. We saw kind of conspiracy theories, trying to make it difficult to discern what the truth is. So in that sense, I think that the relationship between them, even when it's not overt, there is authoritarian learning. Because then Beijing can see what Russia has had success with, and it helps then Beijing get up the learning curve more quickly. So I do think that this is an area we need to continue to keep an eye on. I think we should expect Moscow and Beijing to look to deepen their coordination in this domain. I think we see they already conduct a number of exchanges that are designed to share technologies and processes to control the internet. I think that there has been some Chinese input into helping Russia move towards this sovereign internet. So I think that coordination could grow. I think we could see them continue. They have a little bit of a divide and conquer model. Russia has been primarily focused on weakening and dividing democratic societies in Europe and the United States. China has in many ways been looking towards Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Latin America, and Africa. So it's almost as if like because they in many ways, in many situations, sing from the same sheet of music, this divide and conquer strategy really allows them, I think, to cover more ground together. I think we could see them leveraging each other's platforms. And by that, I mean Russia leveraging Chinese platforms in particular to broaden their reach. I think, there's an element of this in the technology cooperation also. They have a lot of technology-focused dialogues and exchanges that are focused on things like AI. And so if they're doing some kind of joint development in certain areas. And so, for example, I think Russia's company called NTech Lab, which is a leading developer of AI and facial recognition, had worked with a Chinese company who manufactures video surveillance solutions. And they jointly produced a wearable camera with facial recognition. So I think things like that could help them together accelerate their digital innovation. And then, of course, we see them extremely aligned in international institutions working to shape norms and standards around the internet, the appropriate use of AI and other things. So I also really want to foot stomp the point Alina made too about that it's the Russia model in some ways that's more accessible for states. But I think what's remarkable then is, I guess the way I think of it is when countries who are looking to Russia and China, they now have many different options for how they can implement digital authoritarianism in their countries. They're different models. And in some cases, I think more in full of autocracies, China's model will dominate. But in these more mixed regimes, hybrid regimes, where leaders want to maintain at least the veneer of democracy, and they maybe feel they can't get away with such blatant repression, then like what Alina was saying, Russia's model becomes extremely attractive. And so I think in that way, it lets leaders kind of mix and match elements of the Russian and Chinese models. And that, in that sense, makes this digital authoritarianism accessible for a lot more states. And that's also concerning. So I think there's a lot happening in this space. There are obviously, and it's important to acknowledge, there's limits on what Russia and China would be willing to do together. But in this democracy and human rights space, I feel like the limits are the least significant. I think they will be willing to do quite a lot together. And it, I think, then really increases the headwinds that the United States and its allies faces as Russia and China, if they're not overtly coordinating, at least they're aligned. And that makes it a more formidable challenge.
Thank you, Andrea. I mean, one of the reasons we're organizing this series is to understand look at different regions and see how they're using. I mean, in the last session, we'll look at different countries in Africa to see how they can kind of pick and choose in the toolkit of digital authoritarianism. Alina, we know, it's well known by now that Russia has conducted and still conducts political interference operations in order to erode Western voters' overall trust in democracy. And we know that democracy is eroding in Europe and in North America. How successful has Russia actually been? How much is it a combination of Russia's cyber operations and then other issues?
Excuse me. Thanks so much, Marie. Do you mean in terms of how successful has Russia been in terms of developing and using its cyber capabilities to undermine democracies? Was that the question?
Exactly, yeah.
Well, I think we've seen over time that Russia has been, at least in the cyber domain, I think we have to distinguish here from the information space, because I think often when we say cyber, we mean that in a very general way. But I think if we look at how Russia has conducted its own foreign policy over the last several years, and where the Kremlin has invested a significant amount of resources, it's very much been in this below threshold asymmetric space. The term hybrid warfare is often used for that, although I think we have to talk about these issues in a much more refined and nuanced way. So what does that really encompass? Well, certainly we've seen a growing sophistication in Russian cyber capabilities, meaning the many cyber operations, cyber attacks, including ransomware attacks that originate in Russia, even if we don't know the extent to which the Russian government is inciting these attacks, but certainly they are tolerating them and harboring many cyber criminal organizations and individuals without making any arrests of any kind. There was a very interesting investigation recently came out from the UK that showed that there's at least 2 individual cyber hackers who live in completely plain sight in Russia, millionaire lifestyles, and they're wanted for various kinds of damaging cyber hack operations, including ransomware attacks. And the Russian government knows where they are, but they're not doing very much about it. So we've definitely seen a massive uptick in ransomware attacks originating from Russia, in a massive intelligence breach operations that are affecting American companies, American government agencies, as well as broader European, Western democratic societies. It almost feels like every week there's a new cyber operation of some kind. And we don't know to what extent the Russian government is using this data, how they're using it. We know the intelligence agencies have now stepped up their capabilities significantly. So we have the GRU, the Military Intelligence Agency, the SVR, as well as the FSB, all investing in these cyber capabilities. And so I think they're becoming incredibly problematic and incredibly effective at disrupting Western societies, and they're incredibly damaging and costly as well. I think on the information space, in terms of things like information influence operations or disinformation campaigns, I think that has had a bit of a limited return on investment for Russia, if you will. I mean, certainly after the 2016 elections in the United States and what we saw in terms of Russian election interference around those elections through various kinds of disinformation attacks, impersonation attempts of Americans. This has all come to light now in the last 5 years, the various investigations here in the US. But we've certainly seen now greater awareness of these kinds of operations. And certainly it's very difficult to say to what extent Russia is still active in all kinds of disruptive information influence ops, to what extent these are really domestic actors now who are instigating, all kinds of false narratives and spreading disinformation around various issues, including public health and vaccines. And I think here it's really interesting to see how, in many ways, of course, the Russian government has tested disinformation and propaganda attacks on its own people first over the years, and then slowly expanded out to Ukraine, other countries in Russia's periphery, and then finally to Western democracies, including the United States and Canada. But I think now at home, the effect has been partially that Russians have never built any trust in their own government over the last 20-something years since Mr. Putin has been in power, and since he's used media, traditional and new media, for the purposes of spreading disinformation and propaganda. And I think part of the reason, why we're seeing, for example, very low vaccination rates in Russia today, despite having a serious issue with the COVID pandemic, is partially because Russians don't trust their own government institutions. They don't trust the Sputnik vaccine, which we've seen is a relatively effective vaccine, but Russians themselves won't get it. So of course we have vaccine hesitancy all over the world, but it's really quite shocking to see how low vaccination rates have been in countries like Russia, also some others. A lot of that, I think, has to do with a bit of backfiring by the Russian government in this information influence operation game. So I'll just leave it there. I think we see a very mixed picture. I think the cyber issue is the dominant issue that we need to be focusing on. And I think the Biden administration is focusing on that. So are other countries. But to be honest, I haven't seen much incentive and much movement by the Russian side to really make real progress here.
Thanks, Alina. We're getting some questions from the audience, but I'd like to ask at least one question to Amin. According to Facebook recently, an Iranian network was removed from the social media networking website for participation in what they call inauthentic behaviors. And apparently the source was determined to be the Islamic the Guard Corps. Sorry. How does the Iranian regime spread its message, both within Iran and to an outside audience? And who's in charge of that message? And is it different for a domestic audience?
It used in general. There are two department institution. One of them is, as you mentioned, is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC. The other one is the Ministry of Intelligence of Iran. These two organizations or governmental department, they are do the let's say majority or nearly all cyber ops of Islamic Republic. The IRGC, their main focus is for the outside of the Iran's border. It's, for instance, hacking Iranian diaspora accounts. It can be either Gmail, can be Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Telegram, WhatsApp, and also gathering intelligence about different, for instance, people who used to work for or still working on the Iran sanction for the U.S. government, or people who work for different think tanks which they have a relationship with the government. These are the targets that the IRGC is more interested. The intelligence ministry is more about their operation is more about inside. Domestic operation is, for instance, hacking of the account of the journalists, which they want they want to find what they are doing it, or activists. And also recently we've seen they just expand their scope of operation, intelligence ministry, and they went after also Gulf countries, UAE, Saudi, and Bahrain. But if this is more about the offense, it's more about the hacking, penetration, that account servers, that kind of thing. But if we talk about the misinfo operation, it's more, I would say, if I remember when the whole the Russia operation in terms of the disinfo for the U.S. election in 2019, when the news came out, I told a friend of mine, we will see the Iranian regime. They will replicate the kind of methodology of the Russia, and eventually it happened. For instance, I think a few months ago they did a kind of operation about disinfo about the. In Scotland and also other countries, but these operations, they are not kind of big deal, I would say, because the impact is not that high. And also, but the Iranian regime, they are very, very interested in this kind of operation because they are easy to implement and they are cheap. One thing we shouldn't forget about the kind of cyber ops, especially the hacking. They are in some occasions they are costly. It's costly operation. For instance, they need to hire a hacker, or they need to just pay the hackers. The IRGC, which they usually do lots of. Right now, I'm pretty sure right now we are talking the Iranian state-backed hacker like Charming Kitten or Modi Water. They are doing a kind of hacking operation right now. It's the problem. It's the IRGC has been facing right now. It's because the way they dealt with the Iranian hackers, some of them they left the country and now they live in Turkey, or some of them they got job offer in the Netherlands, and also they work in as I said, they live in Turkey. But the talented hacker, I would say, the black hat hacker, they are. Now the number of them they are inside the country is less. For that reason, their operation is not that sophisticated in comparison with Russia. Because for that reason, we usually see the Iranian state-backed hacker, they just go for the phishing attacks. It's kind of simple one. You shouldn't do lots of coding. You shouldn't think you shouldn't think for the kind of complicated operation. But these are two units, which the IRGC is majority for the international operation, and the intelligence ministry is more about the domestic one.
Thank you. I'd like to raise a few audience questions now. Carl Morton here says, are we heading to multiple versions of the internet? Because the first question he had asked as well is, do your panelists see the realization of a global 5G ISP as an impetus for authoritarian states to build competitive networks based on their own censorship standards? I don't know if one of you can answer that question. What are the risks of having different sovereign internets, since China already has the Great Firewall, and then Russia has had ideas about this as well?
Thanks, Marie. I can start us off there. I think it's also important to remember that it's not just authoritarian states that are thinking in these terms of digital sovereignty or internet sovereignty or cyber sovereignty, whatever kind of sovereignty we want to talk about. But this has also become a term of art in democracies as well, particularly in Europe. Digital sovereignty is part of Brussels thinking and how to move forward with this regulatory agenda. And I think it's actually quite a dangerous path forward, because it de facto acknowledges that we will accept a non-free, non-interoperable online space, the one that has been already established in China and is increasingly being established in Russia and other countries. So, I think we have to really think about how our terms reflect what we envision for the future of a free and open internet. And so this idea of digital sovereignty, how it's being discussed in the context of democracies, I think we need to really take a deep look as to what that would really mean. And I think what it means is that we accept a fragmented splinter net. And I don't think this is, a useful way of thinking about the future of our public discourse online more broadly, because that is where public discourse is happening these days. So I'll just say that, that there's also this term is also being used and actively discussed and thought through in democratic societies as well. And I think it's important for us to remember that everything we do in a democratic setting in terms of tech governance more broadly will be used and abused by autocracies and authoritarian states. We've seen this already happen with some, like the foreign agent law we were talking about earlier. That was actually something that Russia copied directly from the United States, and now has used that to repress free speech in a way the United States never has and nor will. But that's the justification they put forward. We're just doing the same thing that you are doing, democracy, United States, Europe, Canada, whoever have you. So I think we have to remember that, when we put certain ideas out there, put certain regulatory policies out there, it's not happening in a vacuum. Just they're being copied and abused by authoritarian states that want to exert more control on freedom of expression.
Thank you. Andrea or Amin, did you want to add something to this?
I can add something. It's about unfortunately, whether we like it or not, it's already happened in Iran. Right now, we have a kind of, as I mentioned, we have a kind of national internet, which, users they have a kind of let's say golden cage, which they can open any Iranian domestic website without any problem, and also it costs them cheap in comparison with the non-Iranian. And it's already happened. Iranian people, they are dealing with it. And just look at the situation of the internet censorship in Iran, right? That amongst all of the popular, let's say, social media platform, Instagram is the only one which is not blocked. The rest of them, just name it, they are blocked.
Thank you, Amin. Andrea, did you want to add something?
No, I mean, I think Alina covered it really well, and just kind of being cognizant, it for the most part, a lot of this is happening in authoritarian regimes, but it is also some kind of illiberal leaning democratic regimes, looking at what's happening in places like Brazil or India or other places. This kind of move for sovereignty is strong. And, I think it'll be interesting to see, how successful Russia is with its efforts to establish this more sovereign internet. I think it's still as of yet untested about, the success that they've had with this model and their ability to implement it after starting from such a different place as China was. And so I think a lot of regimes are likely to be paying close attention to what Russia is doing. And I do think in many ways, the success that Russia has with its model and with its efforts in the direction that it's going could lead, more and more countries to look to emulate what Russia is doing. So I think that'll be an important bellwether. And again, as Alina's been talking about, a lot of learning by these regimes, Russia can be a model that other illiberal leaders aspire to. And so Putin's success with this is likely to have a knock-on effect.
Thank you. Perhaps we'll ask the last questions. Let's say, when Russia, for example, is demanding that companies store their citizens' data within their borders, and they institute data localization requirements where information can be accessed by security agencies, how should social media companies based in the US, mostly in the Silicon Valley, handle these issues? So what should their response be? And then perhaps to the three of you as well, how can democracies such as the US and Canada and Europe build more resilience against digital authoritarianism? Next, in January, we will have our last discussion, and we'll look at how Canada and US can collaborate on this. So I'd like to have some of your ideas as well. Perhaps we can start with Alina, and then we'll go Amin and Andrea.
Sure, thanks, Marie. I'll just take the question about what is the role of social media companies and industry here. And I think there's a tendency to see this in very black and white terms. I give a recent example that I think many in our audience certainly followed, which was the decision by Apple and Google back in September to take down the smart voting app that was produced and made by Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader, and his anti-corruption group. And this was derided, I think, across the board by commentators, governments, everyone. But at the end of the day, I think we have to ask ourselves, what was the solution here? We know that companies have actually been trying to not comply with these increasingly draconian measures. They have paid fines. Twitter had its speed slowed down by the Russian government, for example, because it was slow walking a compliance requirement. And in this most recent example, this was in the lead up to the Russian elections, government intelligence agents, as we presume they were, basically harassed and threatened employees of these companies who are nationals, Russian nationals. So there's very little that companies could do under the threat of their staff being held potentially criminally liable when the company was not complying with various kinds of laws. And so I think the question is, what were they supposed to do? Continue with non-compliance, put their employees at risk? There's very few avenues here. And frankly, I don't think we've thought through what the role of what we want the role of these companies to be. There's a desire, obviously, to think about anti-competition, antitrust policy in the United States, which I think is a separate issue. But we saw almost complete silence from democratic governments more broadly about these more recent moves, which are a part of a broader pattern to use Western companies to push through these repressive anti-free speech, anti-free expression measures. And there's no good answers out there, unfortunately, because it's perhaps more politically popular to beat up on big tech, which of course they have their faults, these companies, no question about that. But at the same time, we have to remember that they also provide a really key service. And I think we have to decide, are these platforms now enemies of democracy, which that's been the case, I think, in popular discourse more recently, or are they potential partners in these specific situations? And I think until we decide that, we're not going to have any good options there, nor will we really know what we want companies to do, because the idea that these private groups, these industry groups, should be the embodiment of freedom of speech and democratic values and principles, and this is what we expect of private industry, I think is an illusion. These companies, like all private companies, tobacco companies, energy companies, are there for business purposes. And so what do we want these companies to do? How do we want them to behave? How do we relate to them as democracies and democratic governments? I think is a really open question going forward. And we don't have a lot of very clear pathways for solutions here.
Thank you. Amin, do you want to go next?
Sure. I would say, in terms of the social media company, they don't have any the office in Iran. And also due to US sanction, there is a relationship with the tech companies in the Silicon Valley and also with the Iranian regime, which, from my point of view, unfortunately, is good. It's good because at least we are in this position that says, okay, we know the tech company, they are not going to comply with the Iranian regime request. But at the same time, when you look at also the recent example, when you look at the Facebook leaks, for instance, you can see the investment of the tech companies in terms of the let's say, English language, or let's say Farsi, Persian. It's nothing, because there isn't any business interest for them. And from the business point of view, I understand. But at the same time, it becomes a kind of, the very, very good platform for the different misinfo ops, and also it becomes a very good tools for the Iranian regime to just manipulate the platform. Just today, we've seen lots of Instagram account of the lots of people who were killed. The people who were killed in November 2019 by the Iranian regime, and their mothers, they have the Instagram account. All of them, they suddenly shut down, because what the Iranian regime they've been doing is they just do a kind of mass report, and Instagram AI automatically take down the account. I would say it's just the only thing I would say is it makes sense from my point of view. It's the tech company, let's say, Facebook, they invest more in terms of there's more take care of the non-English users, and in terms of what the Western countries, such as US or Canada, they can do it. I would say it's more put pressure on the Iranian regime in terms of the internet. In terms of for instance, internet freedom, and also tech company which they sell by any chance tools and services to the Iranian regime. Just be more mindful about it. That's because because unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know, it's now Iranian regime, they just buy nearly all of the equipment from China, which is a kind of, I would say, from the Western countries such as US. It's difficult to just convince, let's say, Huawei to just do not sell to the Iranian regime.
Thank you, Amin. Last but not least, Andrea.
Great. So a couple of things. I think there's a lot of things the West can do. I'm hoping, though, there's different, I think, different tools in different environments. And so in the authoritarian systems, I think, as Amin was just alluding to, there's a lot of constraints and not a lot of opportunity for the United States to do all that much to affect the way that these regimes are using technologies, especially when they can acquire a lot of that technology from places like China. But so, small steps that the United States and other democracies can take is to try to expand and modernize legislation to help ensure that US entities aren't enabling the human rights abuses. So we could put export controls on hardware that incorporates AI-enabled biometric identification technologies. We could impose further sanctions on businesses and entities that give surveillance technology training and equipment to authoritarian regimes that are implicated in human rights abuses. I think we could use legislation that prevents US companies from investing in companies that are building AI tools for repression. And of course, we can use the Global Magnitsky Act to sanction foreign individuals who are actually implicated in human rights abuses using technology. Where there's a lot more space and where I feel like it's more of kind of an open battlefield is in some of the kind of hybrid regimes, weak democracies that are adopting these technologies, a lot of which are hybrid, right? So a lot of these regimes, there is a demand for things like smart cities and better surveillance in order to crack down on crime and other things. The problem is that they become dual use, and you can use them for perfectly good reasons, but then you can turn around and use them to target members of your opposition and abuse those technologies. And in my mind, I think that's where really the critical battle space is. In some of the early research that we've done, it does seem like there's a relatively strong correlation between digital repression and backsliding. It wasn't a driver, it was kind of a soupy mess. In terms of whether the digital acquisition of digital technologies predated the backsliding. And in most cases, it was happening kind of along with the backsliding. And the way that we've thought about it is basically that these technologies are kind of lowering the costs of leaders' efforts to consolidate power. And so I think there's a lot of thought that needs to be given about what we do in these types of countries, in these fragile democracies. We clearly need to think about how we can strengthen the political and legal frameworks that govern how surveillance technologies are used. We can look to build capacity of the civil society groups and watchdog organizations. But again, I think we have to distinguish between the environments that we're addressing. In the authoritarian regimes, I think it's really hard. There's really serious restrictions on what we're able to do. But there's this whole basket of countries where I think we need to think about how to build more guardrails and more resilience to governments that are looking to adopt some of these technologies.
Thank you so much, Andrea. To the three of you, Amin, Alina, Andrea, thank you so much for participating in the discussion today. It was really fascinating and learned a lot, actually, especially about the early Russia and Iran tactics. So thank you to the three of you, and thank you to the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa for their support. To the audience, the video will remain online, and don't forget to sign up for our next event, which will be in January, which will be the closing event to this special series. Thank you very much, and have an excellent day, everyone.
Thank you.